Eliza Hale crossed into Wyoming for a kitchen job. The boarding house owner saw the 2-year-old asleep on her shoulder and closed the door. By nightfall, Eliza had nowhere to sleep. Then one rancher noticed what everyone else missed. She was already working. The town of Dry Creek was little more than a railroad siding, a row of false front buildings, 2 saloons, a feed store, a church with peeling white paint, and a livery stable that smelled of hay, leather, horse sweat, and dust. Freight wagons came through when the roads allowed it. Cattle crews came through when they were paid. Families came through when they believed there was something better farther west. Some stayed. Some discovered they had made a mistake. Eliza was 29 years old and had been a widow for 11 months. Her husband Nathan had driven freight wagons before an accident on an icy grade took his life. What little money remained after the burial had gone quickly. Rent, food. A doctor's visit when Lucy developed a fever. Then another month of rent. Then another sack of flour. Eliza had sold the table first because she could eat from a crate. Then the good chair because she could sit on the bed. Then the bed because she and Lucy could sleep on blankets. By the time a woman in Wyoming wrote that she needed help in a boarding house kitchen, Eliza had almost nothing left to sell except the small wedding band on her finger. She did not sell it. She bought 2 train tickets with the last of Nathan's freight company pay, packed 1 change of clothes for Lucy, a wool shawl, a small Bible, a tin sewing case, and 3 letters she could not bring herself to throw away. For 3 days she had believed the journey west was an answer. At Dry Creek it became another closed door. I asked for a worker, the boarding house owner had said, not a nursery. Eliza stood on the porch for a moment, holding the sleeping child tighter, then walked away before anyone could mistake silence for begging. After leaving the boarding house, Eliza walked until Lucy began to stir. The child lifted her head, looked at the unfamiliar street, and whispered, "Mama, I'm here." Eliza said that was the one promise she was certain she could keep. She went first to the general store and asked if they needed someone to scrub floors after closing. No. She tried the laundry behind the hotel. No room. She asked the wife of a baker whether she could wash pans for bread. The woman looked at Lucy and then at Eliza. You cannot wash pans while holding a child. Eliza did not argue. By dusk, Lucy was hungry enough to stop asking questions. That frightened Eliza more than crying would have. Near the livery stable, an older hostler named Mr. Bell saw her standing beside the water trough. He had the cautious face of a man who had seen every kind of traveler, including the ones who lied well. "You waiting on someone?" he asked. "No, sir. Got a room?" Eliza looked down at Lucy. "Not yet." Mr. Bell glanced toward the stable office, then toward the street. He was not a wealthy man, and the livery was not his to give away. Still, he brought out a cup of water and half a heel of bread. Eliza broke the bread and gave the softest part to Lucy. "Thank you," she said. Mr. Bell nodded. Uncomfortable with gratitude he did not believe he had earned. Then a ranch hand came from the stable dragging a split trace strap behind him. The leather had torn close to the buckle. He swore under his breath, "Boss will skin me." This was supposed to go back on the wagon tonight. Eliza looked at the strap. Nathan had repaired harness by lantern light hundreds of times. When his fingers cracked in winter, she had helped pull waxed thread through the holes. When he broke a harness needle, she had learned how to hold an awl straight enough to avoid slicing the leather. She had not touched a heavy strap since his death. "May I see it?" she asked. The ranch hand looked at her as though the question had come from the horse. "You know harness?" "Some." He handed it over. Eliza flexed the leather, examined the tear, and shook her head. "A straight stitch will pull through. It needs a patch behind the split." Mr. Bell raised an eyebrow. Eliza opened her tin sewing case. Most of what it held was for cloth, but the thickest needle would do if she softened the leather and made the holes first. Mr. Bell disappeared into the stable and returned with an awl, a scrap of worn harness leather, and a short length of waxed thread. "You mend it," he said. "I'll give the little one a cup of milk." Eliza looked at him. "And bread?" He almost smiled. "And bread." That was how Thomas Reed first saw her. He rode into the livery yard just as the last sunlight slipped behind the low western ridge. Thomas was in his early 40s, broad-shouldered from years in a saddle, with a face darkened by wind and sun rather than vanity. He owned Red Willow Ranch 12 miles north of town, though he still worked cattle beside the men he paid. He was known for paying on time, saying little, and never asking a hired hand to ride into weather he would not enter himself. He was not known for rescuing strangers. He dismounted near the stable door and saw Mr. Bell warming milk in a dented tin cup. Then he saw Lucy asleep on a folded feed sack. Then he saw Eliza on an overturned bucket beneath the livery lamp, bent over a damaged trace strap. She was pulling waxed thread through the leather with both hands. Her knuckles were red from the strain. The stitch line was neat. Thomas watched for several seconds before speaking. "That yours?" Eliza looked up. Her first instinct was to place herself between the stranger and Lucy. "No, sir." The ranch hand stepped out of the stable. "Mine. She says she can save it." Thomas took the strap when Eliza handed it to him. He turned the patch over, pulled hard against the buckle, and examined the holes. "Who taught you?" "My husband." The answer was quiet enough that Thomas did not ask the next obvious question. He looked toward Lucy. "She yours?" Eliza's shoulders tightened. "Yes. How old?" "2." Mr. Bell gave Thomas a look that said there was more to the story, but Eliza spoke before either man could. "I am not asking for money." Mr. Bell offered food for the repair. Thomas looked back at the strap. "I did not say you were asking." Eliza said nothing. He could have paid for the repair and left. Instead, he asked, "You cook?" Eliza almost laughed, but she was too tired. "Yes." "Keep accounts?" That question surprised her. "Enough to know when they do not balance." Thomas nodded once. "My cook left last month to care for her sister. We've been burning beans and blaming the stove ever since. I can offer 10 days' work at Red Willow. Wages: a room in the old foreman's cabin. Meals included. At the end of 10 days, either of us can say it is not working." Eliza stared at him. This was not how charity was usually offered. Charity came with soft voices, pitying eyes, and the expectation that gratitude would make a person agreeable. Thomas sounded as though he were discussing a fence crew. "What are the wages?" she asked. Mr. Bell looked down to hide his smile. Thomas named a fair weekly amount for kitchen and housework, then added, "If you take on the ranch books, that is separate work. We would settle that separately." Eliza looked at Lucy. A warm room, food, work she could be paid for, but 12 miles from town with a man she did not know. Thomas seemed to read the hesitation. "Mr. Bell knows me. So does the storekeeper, the preacher, and half the men who owe me small sums and pretend they forgot. You can ask any of them before you answer." Mr. Bell grunted. "Reed is stubborn, but he is not dangerous unless you are a fence post put in crooked." For the first time that day, Eliza nearly smiled. She asked 3 more questions. Would Lucy stay with her? Yes. Would the room have a door that locked? Yes. Would Thomas advance part of the first week's wages so she could buy medicine and a second pair of socks for Lucy? He did not answer immediately. Then he said, "I can advance wages for work already agreed, not a gift." Eliza let out a breath she had been holding since the boarding house door closed. "Then I will take the 10 days. Red Willow Ranch did not look like salvation when Eliza first saw it. That helped. It looked like work. The ranch house was a long, practical structure of timber and rough siding, with a porch that leaned slightly at one corner and a kitchen chimney blackened by years of hard winters. Beyond it stood a bunkhouse, barn, corrals, smokehouse, root cellar, and several low sheds built wherever someone had once decided they were needed. The yard was busy even after dark. Men carried tack inside. A dog barked at Thomas's horse. Someone argued with a gate hinge. Nobody stopped working because a widow and a child had arrived. Thomas showed Eliza the old foreman's cabin first. It was small. 1 room, 1 iron stove, 1 narrow bed, and a wooden peg rail on the wall. But the roof was sound. There was a lock on the door. There were 2 folded blankets on the bed. Lucy touched one with both hands as if she had forgotten blankets could belong to a bed instead of a train bench. "We sleep here?" she asked. Eliza swallowed. "For a little while." Thomas set a lantern on the table. "Kitchen starts before daylight, but not tomorrow. Tomorrow you sleep until the girl wakes you. I can start in the morning." "I know. Then why would I not?" Thomas leaned against the doorframe. "Because you look like you have not slept properly in a week, and a tired cook burns food just as well as the rest of us." That was the closest thing to kindness he allowed himself to say. The next morning Eliza woke before Lucy anyway. Habit was stronger than permission. She dressed in the dim cabin, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and stepped into the cold before sunrise. The ranch kitchen was worse than she expected. There were sacks stacked without dates, a flour barrel with a loose lid, potatoes sprouting in a warm corner, coffee stored beside soap, and 3 pieces of bacon hanging where mice had already found one edge. A young ranch hand named Eli was trying to make biscuits. He had created something closer to roof shingles. Eliza looked at the tray. Eli looked at her. I followed the directions. Whose directions? Mine. That explains it. He laughed so suddenly he nearly dropped the pan. By breakfast, Eliza had eggs in the skillet, beans reheated without scorching, and a pan of biscuits that broke open with steam instead of resistance. The men became quiet in the way hungry men become quiet when food is finally good. Thomas came in last. He did not compliment her. He ate 2 biscuits. That was enough. After breakfast, Eliza began moving supplies. She asked permission before changing anything. Thomas told her, "If it keeps us from eating soap-flavored coffee, change it." She put flour and meal in dry storage, moved potatoes to the cellar, marked open sacks, and found 3 jars of preserved fruit hidden behind a box of horseshoe nails. Then she found the ledger, or rather, the collection of paper that Red Willow called a ledger. There were feed purchases on the same page as wages. Coffee and lamp oil were listed under cattle expenses. 2 invoices had been folded inside without totals. One had a number crossed out and rewritten without explanation. Eliza stared at it long enough for Thomas to notice. "Bad?" he asked. "Do you want the polite answer?" "No." "Then yes." He pulled out a chair. "Show me." That afternoon she explained where the household accounts disappeared into ranch expenses, and why he could not tell what the kitchen actually cost. Thomas listened. He did not understand every figure immediately, but he understood the danger of not understanding them. "Can you fix it?" "I can separate the books. I cannot fix numbers that were never written down." "Fair. And if I do the books, that is not kitchen work." Thomas looked at her, then nodded. Separate wages. That mattered more to Eliza than he knew. She had spent almost a year hearing people describe whatever they might give her: a bed, a plate, a favor. Thomas was the first person in months who asked what her work was worth. The 10-day trial became harder on the 3rd day. That was when Wade Mercer returned from the North pasture. Wade was Red Willow's foreman, a capable cattleman with a scar through one eyebrow and no patience for surprises. He stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw Lucy sitting on the floor with wooden spoons. Then he looked at Eliza, then at Thomas. "What is this?" Thomas continued drinking coffee. "Kitchen help. With a child." Eliza's face went still. Thomas set down the cup. "With a child." Wade lowered his voice, but not enough. "Winter is 6 weeks off. Feed is high. We lost 12 head in the South Draw, and you are adding mouths." Eliza felt the words like a hand against her back. She had heard them in other forms. No room, no children, no complications. Thomas glanced toward her. "I am adding an employee. Employees eat, so do you." Wade's jaw tightened. "I am saying kindness gets expensive." Eliza spoke before Thomas could answer. "Then do not charge him for kindness. Charge him for my work." Wade looked at her. Eliza held his gaze. "If I do not earn my wages, tell me at the end of 10 days. Wade did not apologize, but he nodded once. Fair enough. That became Eliza's private measure of the ranch. Not whether people liked her, whether they dealt fairly with what she did. On the 5th day, Lucy developed a cough. Eliza heard it before dawn and went cold with fear. She had lost Nathan in a season that began with coughing. The memory did not care that a 2-year-old's cold was not the same illness. It only remembered helplessness. Eliza carried Lucy to the kitchen wrapped in a blanket and worked with one arm until Thomas walked in. He took one look at the child and said, "Doctor, she does not have a fever." "Then the doctor can say that too. I cannot lose a day's wages." Thomas frowned. "You are not losing wages because your child is sick." Eliza stiffened. "I will make up the hours." He started to argue, then stopped. "All right, you make them up when she is well." That answer allowed her to accept help without feeling owned by it. Thomas saddled a gentle mare and rode beside Eliza to town. The doctor said Lucy had a cold, no more, but warned them to keep her warm and fed. At the general store, Thomas reached for his wallet when Eliza bought cough syrup, wool socks, and a small jar of molasses. She stopped him. "I have my advance." "I know. Then let me use it." He put his wallet away. That afternoon, while Lucy slept in the cabin, Thomas left a load of split firewood outside the door. He did not mention it. Eliza did not thank him for it. She simply used it. By the 9th day, the kitchen ran on time. The storeroom made sense. The men had stopped asking whether there would be enough supper after a late ride. Wade no longer watched Lucy as though she were an unexpected expense with shoes. He brought her a smooth piece of wood shaped like a horse. "Scrap," he told Eliza. The carving had a mane. Eliza did not point that out. On the 10th evening, Thomas came to the kitchen after the men had gone to the bunkhouse. Eliza was balancing the separated household ledger. Lucy slept on 2 chairs pushed together beside the stove. Thomas stood across the table. 10 days. Eliza looked up. I know. I want you to stay. She waited. He almost smiled. You are going to ask about wages again. Yes, they negotiated, not because Eliza was ungrateful, because gratitude was not a wage. She agreed to remain through the winter as cook and house manager. The books would be paid separately. The cabin would be included, but Thomas reduced the wage only by the amount they both agreed the room was worth. He wrote the agreement in the ledger. Eliza read it before signing. That night, after Lucy was asleep, she opened the small Bible she had carried across 2 states and tucked the agreement inside the front cover. Not because it was sacred, because it was the first paper in almost a year that described what she could do instead of what she lacked. The first snow came early. At Red Willow, early snow was not beautiful for long. It covered ruts, buried grass, slowed cattle, froze water troughs, and turned every ordinary task into heavier work. Thomas and Wade spent longer hours outside. Eliza began cooking larger breakfasts and packing food that could be eaten cold from a saddlebag. She learned which men drank coffee before speaking and which ones became reckless when hungry. She learned that Eli could repair a stove hinge, but could not remember where he put a hammer. She learned that Wade, who had once called Lucy an added mouth, cut every apple into thin slices so the child believed she had more of it. Lucy grew stronger. Her cheeks filled out. She began waiting each afternoon at the edge of the porch when riders came in. Thomas's bay horse always reached the yard before the others. Lucy would point and announce, "Tom," never Mr. Reed, just Tom. He pretended not to be pleased. Eliza noticed anyway. The ranch also began to reveal weaknesses that good weather had hidden. The most serious was in the storeroom. Eliza had reorganized it, but the numbers from before her arrival were unreliable. One November morning she opened what should have been a full flour barrel and smelled damp grain. The bottom third had spoiled. The next barrel was sound but half empty. She checked the ledger. According to the old entries, they had more than enough flour to last until the December freight wagon. According to the barrels, they did not. She counted beans, salt pork, cornmeal, coffee, dried apples, potatoes. Then she checked lamp oil because darkness could be as dangerous as hunger in winter. By noon, she knew the truth. They were not starving, but they were much closer to shortage than Thomas believed. Eliza found him in the barn repairing a stirrup leather. "I need you in the kitchen." Something in her voice made him put the leather down. Wade joined them at the table. Eliza showed them the barrels first, then the figures. If the freight wagon arrives on schedule, we are uncomfortable but fine. If it is a week late, we cut portions. If it is 2 weeks late and we have riders staying in, we have a problem. Wade swore softly. Thomas stared at the old ledger. How did we miss this? Eliza could have blamed the men who kept bad records before her. Instead, she said, I trusted the old totals before I checked every sealed barrel. I should not have. Thomas looked at her. Those numbers were not yours. The count is mine now. That answer changed something between them, not affection. Trust. Thomas sent word to town for additional flour and meal. 2 days later, the sky turned the color of iron. By afternoon, snow was moving sideways across the yard. The freight wagon did not come, neither did 2 line riders expected from the north pasture. Wade wanted to send 3 men out immediately. Thomas looked at the storm and shook his head. Not blind. We wait until first light unless they reach the old line shack. If they miss the shack, then 3 more lost men do not help them. No one liked the decision. That did not make it wrong. By midnight, the wind was shaking the kitchen windows. Lucy slept in the cabin while Eliza sat at the table with the food ledger and a lantern turned low. Thomas came in with snow on his coat. Still counting? Planning. He pulled off his gloves. For what? For the freight wagon not coming tomorrow. Thomas did not dismiss the possibility. Eliza turned the paper toward him. We stopped baking full loaves for every meal. Cornmeal at breakfast, beans at supper, bread with the midday meal. I can stretch the potatoes with onions. The men riding out get the heavier portions. Everyone else eats enough, not as much as they want. Thomas read the list. Coffee. You will survive. That is not an answer. Half strength after noon. He looked offended. Eliza smiled despite herself. It was the first time Thomas saw the expression without exhaustion behind it. Then the wind struck the house again and the smile was gone. You need to go after those riders, she said, at light. Then go after them. Do not ride to town for food too. He studied her. You are telling me to trust this plan. I am telling you we can hold the ranch for several days if we are disciplined. Those men cannot eat anything if they freeze in the north pasture. Thomas looked toward the dark window. That was the choice. Food frightened him because he was responsible for everyone under his roof. Missing riders frightened him because responsibility extended beyond the roof. He could chase supplies. Or he could trust Eliza's count and use the daylight to find his men. At first light, he chose the men. Thomas, Wade, and Eli rode north with ropes, blankets, and a thermos of hot broth wrapped in wool. Eliza stood on the porch until snow erased them. Then she went back inside and started breakfast. She did not spend the morning staring through the window. There was too much to do. She moved the kitchen table closer to the stove. She set a pot of beans to soak. She mixed cornmeal with the last sweet milk before it soured. She asked the oldest ranch hand, Martin Pike, to help bring potatoes from the cellar before drifting snow blocked the door. When one of the barn boys complained about smaller biscuits, Eliza handed him an extra scoop of beans and said, "You are not being starved, you are being planned for." He never complained again. By late afternoon, no riders had returned. Darkness came early. Lucy sat at the kitchen table, turning Wade's wooden horse over in her hands. "Tom?" she asked. Eliza kept stirring the soups. "He is working. Snow. Yes, Tom Snow." Eliza's hand stopped for half a second. "Yes, Tom is in the snow." She did not let fear change the meal. That was the work in front of her. The yard dog began barking shortly after 7. Eliza was through the door before she remembered her shawl. Lanterns moved through the storm. First one, then 2, then 4. Thomas came in on foot, leading a horse carrying one of the missing riders. Wade followed with the second man slumped in the saddle, conscious but shaking violently. They had found both near the line shack. One horse had gone down. The men had been trying to walk the final mile when Thomas's group reached them. There was no cheering. There was work. Eliza brought the injured rider into the kitchen, removed his wet outer clothes with help from Martin, wrapped him in dry blankets, and placed warm bricks near his feet without pressing heat directly against numb skin. She gave him warm broth a little at a time. Thomas stayed until the man's shaking eased. Only then did he sit. Eliza put a bowl in front of him. "Eat? The others?" "Already fed." "How much flour?" She gave him a look. Eat, he did. The freight wagon did not arrive the next day, or the day after that. For 5 days the ranch lived by Eliza's plan. Nobody starved. Nobody ate lavishly. The riders with the hardest work received more. The kitchen scraps went to stock or stew instead of the waste barrel. Coffee became weak enough that Thomas accused it of being colored water. Eliza told him colored water was cheaper. Even Wade laughed. The storm exposed something else, too. Once the roads opened, Thomas rode to town and collected the delayed flour himself. At the feed store, the owner mentioned that Red Willow had bought more provisions in October than Thomas remembered. Thomas brought the invoice home. Eliza compared it with the old account. The amounts did not match. She checked another invoice, then another. The problem was not theft on a dramatic scale. It was smaller and more ordinary. Rushed purchases. Unrecorded substitutions. Charges copied incorrectly. Supplies paid for twice because nobody could find the first receipt. A ranch could bleed money from 100 cuts no one thought important enough to examine. Thomas sat at the table looking at the papers. How long has this been happening? Long enough that no one noticed because each mistake was small. Wade rubbed the scar above his eyebrow. "We worry about losing cattle and let flour disappear." Eliza shook her head. The flour did not disappear. Attention did. That was the mechanism Red Willow had ignored. Everyone respected the work that happened on horseback because it looked like ranch work. The kitchen, the storeroom, the accounts, the laundry, the lamps, the medicines, the blankets, the meals before dawn. Those things were noticed only when they failed. Eliza had spent months being treated the same way. People saw the child in her arms before they saw the work she could do. At Red Willow, Thomas began correcting both mistakes. He required receipts for supply runs. Wade began writing down changes instead of trusting memory. Eliza kept separate books for household and cattle expenses. When one of the men took food for a 2-day ride, it was counted without being resented. When Eliza spent extra money on fruit for Lucy and the recovering rider, she marked why. Nothing became perfect. The ranch still lost cattle. Bread still burned occasionally. 1 month the lamp oil ran low because Eliza herself wrote the wrong number on an order. She admitted it before anyone found the mistake. Thomas rode to town and bought more. No one called her incompetent. No one called her a miracle either. They treated the mistake as part of work. That mattered. Winter settled in for real after Christmas. Eliza stopped measuring her life in how many days she could survive. She began measuring it in ordinary things. Lucy needed new boots because her feet had grown. A curtain in the cabin let too much cold air through. The kitchen table needed sanding. The ranch dog had learned to sleep outside the cabin door. Thomas began leaving his paperwork in the kitchen because Eliza would return it with questions written in the margins. Sometimes, they argued, he wanted to replace a section of corral fence immediately. She wanted to delay the work until after a feed payment cleared. He said a broken fence could cost cattle. She said an empty account could cost the ranch. Wade listened to both and said he preferred storms. They replaced half the fence and bought the rest of the lumber 2 weeks later. It was not romantic. It was partnership beginning before either of them had a name for it. In February, a woman from town came to the ranch with 2 baskets of laundry. She had heard Eliza sometimes took washing for extra money. While they talked, the woman glanced toward Lucy, who was building a corral from kindling beside the stove. Hard to get much done with one that age, she said. Eliza knew the tone. Months earlier, she would have heard judgment in it before anything else. Now she answered simply, "Some days are harder. The work still gets done." The woman shrugged. "I suppose it does." That small exchange stayed with Eliza longer than she expected, not because she had won an argument, because she no longer needed to. Her work was visible. Her wages were real. Her child was fed, her door locked at night. Her name stood in Red Willow's books beside work that mattered. By March, she had saved enough money to leave if she wanted. That fact changed everything. A home chosen without the power to leave can feel dangerously close to dependence. Eliza needed to know the difference. She counted her savings twice, folded the bills into an envelope, and sat alone after Lucy had gone to sleep. For months, she had told herself she stayed because winter made travel difficult. Then because Lucy was still small. Then because the ranch needed her. All 3 things were true. None was the whole truth anymore. She liked the work. She liked the cabin. She liked hearing Lucy laugh in the yard. She trusted Wade. She trusted Thomas. And that last truth frightened her the most. Trust had once made loss possible. She had loved Nathan. Then a frozen road and a frightened team had taken him in one afternoon. For nearly a year after his death, Eliza had treated attachment as another thing life could seize. Work felt safer. Work could be counted. Love could not. Thomas, perhaps because he understood more than she thought, did not press her. He did not ask what she planned to do with her savings. He did not suggest a better room. He did not speak about the way Lucy ran toward him when he returned from a ride. He simply kept paying her. In April, the boarding house owner from Dry Creek sent a message. Her regular cook had left. She now offered Eliza the kitchen position that had brought her west in the first place. The pay was slightly higher than Red Willow's kitchen wage. The room was in town. Lucy could stay, the note said, provided she does not disturb guests. Eliza read that line 3 times. Then she laughed, not bitterly, almost with wonder. Months ago, those words would have looked like rescue. Now they looked like terms. That evening, she handed the note to Thomas. He read it and set it on the table. "You should take it if you want it." Eliza searched his face. "That is all you have to say?" "No." He looked down at the paper again. "I do not want you to go. But I will not make staying here the price of what I did for you in October." Eliza felt something tighten behind her ribs. Thomas continued, "You worked for every dollar you have. If you choose town, I will take you there myself. If you choose Red Willow, I want you to choose it because it is where you want to be." There it was, the thing Eliza had needed from the beginning. Not rescue. Choice. She picked up the note, folded it once, and placed it beside the stove. "I am not taking the job." Thomas did not smile immediately. "Why?" "Because I already have one. That is not what I meant." "I know." She let him wait. "I am staying because I want to." Only then did he smile. Spring changed Red Willow faster than anyone expected. Snow withdrew from the low fields. Mud swallowed wagon wheels. Calves appeared behind tired cows. The creek rose brown and fast with meltwater. The ranch became noisy again. Eliza moved from winter meals to spring work without noticing the exact day the season changed. She planted onions and beans beside the kitchen. She hired a widow from a neighboring homestead for 2 days each week during laundry season, paying cash rather than meals. When Thomas asked whether the ranch could afford it, she showed him the ledger. It could. The woman brought a baby. No one asked whether the child made her less useful. Wade built a shaded box beside the laundry line where the baby could sleep out of the sun. He claimed it was made from scrap. It had a small carved star on one side. Eliza did not point that out either. The choice Thomas had made for one woman on one cold evening began changing the way Red Willow hired people. Once the ranch learned to measure people by the work they could do instead of the inconvenience others imagined, the habit spread. Not perfectly, not everywhere, but enough to matter inside that fence line. Eliza's place changed too. She no longer introduced herself as the cook. By summer, she managed the house accounts, supply orders, preserved food, paid kitchen help, and a small garden that produced more beans than anyone wanted to admit possible. Thomas added her name to the ranch account at the general store for household purchases. He did not call it a favor. It was authority attached to responsibility. When the storekeeper hesitated the first time, Thomas said, "If she signs it, Red Willow signed it." After that, nobody hesitated. Lucy turned 3 in July. Eliza baked a small cake with dried berries saved from winter. Wade carved a second wooden horse, larger than the first. Eli made Lucy a rope loop and spent an hour teaching her to throw it over a fence post. Thomas gave her nothing in the morning, Eliza noticed. That evening, he led a small gray pony into the yard. "Absolutely not," Eliza said. Thomas held up both hands. "It belongs to the ranch. That is a child's saddle. It is a small saddle. Thomas." Lucy was already whispering, "Horse." Wade turned away because he was laughing. Thomas cleared his throat. "She will not ride without someone holding the lead." Eliza looked at the pony, then at Thomas, then at Lucy, whose entire body had become one hopeful question. 5 minutes. Lucy rode for 20. Thomas walked beside her the whole time. Eliza stood at the corral fence with her arms crossed, pretending fear was the only thing she felt. It was not. There are moments when a person realizes life has quietly become larger than survival. For Eliza, it was not the day she arrived at Red Willow. It was not the winter storm. It was not even the day she chose to stay. It was watching her daughter on a slow gray pony, one small hand gripping the saddle horn while Thomas kept a steady palm against her back. No one was saving anyone in that moment. They were simply living. Late that summer, Thomas asked Eliza to walk with him after supper. They followed the fence line beyond the garden where the cottonwoods bent toward the creek. Thomas was more nervous than he had been riding into the November storm. Eliza knew because he talked too much about fence posts. Finally, she stopped walking. "Thomas," he looked at her, "you have inspected that same stretch of fence 3 times. He exhaled. "I am aware. Then say what you brought me out here to say." He removed his hat. For one dangerous second, Eliza remembered the livery yard, the smell of leather, the sleeping child on a feed sack, and a stranger offering 10 days of wages. But Thomas did not speak as that stranger now. "I do not want to offer you another arrangement," he said. "I do not want you to say yes because you owe me anything. You do not." Eliza's eyes filled, but she did not look away. "I know. Good, because I am asking for something selfish." She waited. "I want you and Lucy here, even if the kitchen runs without you. Even if the books balance without you. Even if you never mend another strap or cook another meal for this ranch. I want a life with you." Eliza could have answered quickly. Once, she might have. But choosing freely had become too important to rush. "Give me time," she said. Thomas nodded. "As much as you need." She made him wait 12 days. Wade claimed it was the longest 12 days in ranch history. Thomas told him to repair something. On the 13th morning, Eliza found Thomas in the tack room. He was oiling a harness. Not just any harness. The old trace strap she had repaired beneath the livery lamp was part of it. The patch had darkened with use, but the stitches still held. Eliza touched the leather. "You kept this?" Thomas looked almost embarrassed. "It was a good repair. That is your reason?" "It is the reason I am willing to admit." Eliza smiled. Then she said, "Yes." Thomas did not ask her to repeat it. He understood. They married in early autumn with a circuit preacher, Wade, Eli, Mr. Bell from the livery, and half a dozen neighbors as witnesses. Lucy fell asleep before the meal ended. Nothing about the wedding erased what came before it. Nathan remained part of Eliza's life because love does not become false when a person dies. Thomas never asked her to put the old letters away. Eliza never asked him to pretend the ranch had become a home only because he married her. It had become one slowly through work, weather, argument, trust, and thousands of ordinary acts no storyteller would have noticed from the road. The next winter, Red Willow faced another storm. This time the flour barrels were dry and counted. The lamp oil was ordered early. The line riders carried extra food because Eliza had added a winter column to the supply book. Nothing dramatic happened. The supplies held. The riders came home, and the ranch moved through the weather without panic. In town, people who once remembered Eliza as the widow turned away from the boarding house began referring to her as the woman who ran Red Willow's household accounts. She did not correct them. She also did not forget. When people came to the ranch looking for work, she asked what they could do before asking what had happened to them. Sometimes there was no job. Sometimes there was. When there was, she stated the wage first. Years later, the repaired harness strap still hung in Red Willow's tack room, dark with oil and dust, its old patch almost the same color as the leather around it. It had been the first piece of work anyone bothered to see.